Good evening, everyone. My name is John Taves, and I'm the event coordinator at McNally Robinson Booksellers. We're broadcasting tonight from Treaty 1 territory, the traditional territory of the Anishinaabe, Cree, Oji-Cree, Dakota, and Dene people, and the homeland of the Métis Nation. In addition, McNally Robinson Booksellers itself rests on the land once occupied by the Métis community of Roostertown. We are here tonight to celebrate the publication of Making the Case, 2S LGBTQ+ Rights and Religion in Schools, published by Purich Books, which is, of course, an imprint of UBC Press. This is a book by Donn Short, Bruce McDougall, and Paul T. Clarke, and we'll be hearing from all of the co-authors this evening. Before we do, I just have a few very brief housekeeping notes. The first is that there will be a conversation following my introduction, after which we'll be opening the floor to questions. At that point, if you do have any questions, please feel free to write them either in the chat or in the Q&A. If you're watching on YouTube, you can feel free to write it in the chat there, and we'll be sure to address those questions as well. This video will remain live, so if you would like to share it with anybody after the broadcast is through, please feel free to do so. Otherwise, I'll get started and introduce all of tonight's participants. Donn Short is a professor of law at the University of Manitoba. He is the founding and current editor-in-chief of the Canadian Journal of Human Rights and a former member of the Manitoba Human Rights Commission. He has published 2 previous books with UBC Press, Don't Be So Gay in 2013 and Am I Safe Here in 2017. Bruce McDougall is a professor at the Allard School of Law at UBC, where, in addition to his work in sexuality and law, he teaches and writes on commercial law subjects. Paul is a professor of educational leadership in the Faculty of Education at the University of Regina. So I'd now ask all of the co-authors to please unmute their audio and video, and we can begin the discussion. Thank you, everyone, for joining us. So I have a number of questions for you folks, and I was hoping that we could start at the beginning of the book. And so first Donn and then Bruce, I was wondering if you could speak to the motivation behind the book.
Yeah, I can start with that. Let me start first by thanking you, John, for hosting our event, and also McNally Robinson. And I also want to thank a bunch of folks at UBC Press, Carrie Kilmartin and Megan Dyer, Nadine Peterson, Randy Schmidt, everybody who's helped our book and supported it along its own journey. Many, many thanks. And to welcome everybody to our event, and thank you for supporting our work by being here. Yeah, we started this book a while ago, and for me, I think what I wanted to do, where I was in my research at the time, is I wanted to contribute to or create a book that was empowering to people who were interested in or already doing supporting 2S LGBTQ+ students in their quest for equal access to education, or what we sometimes refer to in the book as full citizenship in schools, like real, full, robust citizens in schools, not a problem to be solved or discussed in particular classes, and creating schools that were places of inclusion for these students, and really helping them to understand what the law had to say about achieving all that, but who may have felt unempowered about or insecure about the law, because many people are, particularly in the context of what this book addresses, which is from time to time when people oppose this kind of work based on religion-based rights claims. So I would often find myself on panels or presentations, especially with, as I say, people who are already in the school doing that kind of work, teachers or administrators, to say nothing of the students themselves, who either had a misunderstanding of the law, even some very simple concepts, or didn't feel that the law was or could work in a positive way to help them get where we all wanted to get. So I think the motivation for me was to draw on the voices of the 3 of us who contributed to this book, to make it clear just how much support there actually is out there in the law, and in helping to make, as I say, schools more inclusive spaces for 2S LGBTQ+ students. So I guess in sum, I was really trying to create a book that was a bit of a guide, that was something, a tool that was empowering, to encourage people to keep doing this kind of work, and to understand that, in point of fact, more often than not, the law was on the side of us, all of us who are doing that kind of work.
If I can follow up on that, and thank you very much for having us here. I really appreciate this. And I'm speaking to you from the traditional and unceded territory of the Semiahmoo First Nation. The book sort of follows up from work that the three of us have done together or individually previously. And I've written previously with both Paul and Donn on various subjects sort of related to what's in the book. And so to a certain extent, this book it brings together some of the themes that we've worked on before, and extends our work in this area. So a lot of my work, which goes back a few decades, was originally sort of what then we would see as gay and lesbian areas. And so all of us need to expand our horizons and think about things. And so this work really comes from that. And as Donn says, this work is intended to be a positive statement. It's intended to reinforce people's sense that the law is on their side, that things are possible, that they're not alone, that schools can and should be these positive places for 2S LGBTQ plus students.
Oh, thank you very much, folks. Starting with you, Paul, I was wondering if you could speak to the book's intended readership, possibly.
Yes, and before I speak to that, I will echo what Donn and Bruce have said in terms of a big thanks, John, to you and your team. And I acknowledge that I'm on Treaty 4 territory here in Regina, and also the homeland of the Métis and Métis Nation. I had a comment from the Dean. Can people hear me okay?
You are a little bit quiet, Paul.
Okay.
Is there any way of amplifying yourself, possibly?
I'll check my volume, but I'm pretty sure my volume's at max. Yes, it's showing maximum. I'll move into the screen a little bit. I'll cut myself off a bit, but is that helping if I speak a little louder?
Oh, absolutely.
Okay, and if I'm yelling, please let me know and I will back off. So we hope to reach a diverse readership. And so I'll start with the most obvious, those who work in the education sector. So we're interested in teachers, principals, those who work at the board office, in ministries of education, obviously those in faculties of education where I'm situated, both professors and students who have an interest in this area. From a legal perspective, we hope that law schools and law students, judges, once again, those who have an interest in learning about human rights and equality as it relates specifically to this area. And I'd also say in other academic units such as queer or gender studies, and also other folks, say, who are interested in policy as it relates to inclusion and human rights and equality.
Thank you.
Could I add that I think too that that everybody should have an interest in this area. So I echo what Paul says. I think it's meant to be accessible for everybody who can read. Yeah.
Yeah. You know, when my last book came out, I got a very surprising and very nice email from a school board in Ontario where they had bought several hundred copies and gave it to all the new hires in their school board. So I would ask them to check their budgets for this year and do the same with this one. One of the things that I learned in talking with teachers and guidance counselors, people in schools, is how many people there are who want to do this kind of work, but they don't know what to say, or they feel they lack the resources or the training. So any place there's teacher training or professional development training, I would say this is something to put on the pile. And I frankly would really like to see the book read by those people working in faith-based schools, or people who are people of faith who are not in faith-based schools. And the Canadian Council of Catholic bishops, in Alberta, the Edmonton Catholic Teachers, which is a local of the Alberta Teachers Association, people that who I think would be surprised what's in the book, and I know there are a lot of people in those places who do support this work. So I would also add them to the list of people I'd really like to that I intend this book, that I'd like to see read this book.
And if I just one last comment, I would go back to also what Bruce said, that it's highly accessible and it can be read by anybody who can read.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think you mentioned, Paul, the ministers of education. I think that's really important too, because we've seen over the last few years, well, more than the last few years, I guess, since about 2012, in Ontario and Manitoba and Alberta, that that was sort of this battle over gay straight alliances, or GSAs, and they're called different things now. That there isn't really any aspect of our society that doesn't have an interest in this. And but I would just echo ministers of education, assistant ministers, equity or human rights officers, people who develop curriculum, in addition to all the teacher organizations, which I think you mentioned as well.
No, thank you all. And if I might add, from a bookseller perspective as well, too, we have received comments about the book that it is a very rigorous book, but at the same time, it is a very accessible and incredibly readable book. So it holds great value in that regard. A question for Bruce is, can you summarize what points you make in the book, or tell us what the main message of the book is in relation to the law, to us LGBTQ+ students, and religion in the book?
Well, that's a big question. They say that when you're giving a talk on whatever it is, you should have really one idea, possibly two, because otherwise you're going to lose the audience. And this, on the other hand, this book I think has lots of different ideas in it, and my colleagues will probably be able to supplement what I'm going to remember to tell you. The book is really about inclusion mattering. So especially for 2S LGBTQ students, but really for everybody, that it's important to feel welcome, it's important to feel celebrated in the school environment. And that's not just students who are in that school, but it's everybody involved somehow with the school or the education system. We did want to convey the idea, which Donn has mentioned earlier, that the law is on the side of 2S LGBTQ students, that there are ways of approaching these issues that are important to know for teachers, for administrators, and for students. We also think that this is an issue that goes to all sorts of students. So we talk about one particular case, the Jubran case, where a student who identified as heterosexual had to challenge the way the school wasn't acting to make him feel safe. And students have a right to feel safe. Again, not just to LGBTQ students, but heterosexual students. And so it's important that the lessons go there as well. Safe schools matter. It's important that people challenge what their preconceptions are. There's a hidden curriculum, so it's important to challenge what the curriculum says. It's important to challenge how events are organized, how people are addressed, how facilities work in schools. And we address all of those ideas. It's also, we make the point that it's important that difference in sexuality not be treated in the language or from the perspective of a particular faith or religion, that it isn't in the context of schools a morality issue. It's something that it relates to human rights and to inclusion. Whatever individuals' personal views are on these matters, they're not to be brought into the school so that the people in the school, the students in particular, carry that burden. And I guess the other thing that we stress, and I'll let Donn and Paul pick up if they want to add to this, is that schools really need to be safe places for 2S LGBTQ students, because very often students in that position come from environments where they can't be themselves, where they don't feel welcome. A difference in sexuality or gender identity is different from certain other protected statuses, in that if you have if you come from a minority religion, or you come from a particular racialized community or some such thing, often in the home environment, not always, but often in the home environment, you have sort of a built-in support network and people who understand what your situation is right away. And that is sometimes the case, obviously, with 2S LGBTQ students, but it more often than not isn't. And it's important that the schools be made safe for students in those situations.
Yeah, yeah, I would. I agree with that so much. So many 2S LGBTQ plus students are in fact thrown out of their homes, and I would just say, without getting too much into the law, because we really did write a book as a book. It's hard to take one chapter or one section and say this is the important one. The book really is written as a journey, and I do encourage people to read it. But just to go back to something I had said earlier, what I found in talking with people who are interested in doing this kind of work is that there's some very fundamental for law students, fundamental for law professors, fundamental for a lot of us who deal with the law all the time, concepts that aren't necessarily understood by everyone, even fundamental things such as that rights are not absolute, and there's no hierarchy of rights. And I think there is a sense that, and I don't know if this is an American influence or where it comes from, I think there is a sense that the minute someone asserts a religion-based claim, that's the end of the matter, that trumps all other concerns. And in point of fact, as we show time and time again in the book, that's not the case, and that courts and tribunals are willing to find a reasonable, proportionate balance if they have to limit a religion-based right. If they feel that the benefits of the educational initiative or a statutory objective, for example, creating gay-straight alliances, the benefits of that outweighs any impact, especially if it's an insignificant or insubstantial impact on a religion-based claim. And I think people will find that a bit eye-opening, and I hope that they'll find it, as I said earlier, empowering and helpful to the kind of work they do. So for me, again, that's the main message of the book, I think.
Pick up on what Bruce mentioned earlier in terms of inclusion. As we use and understand the term in the book, it's a robust view of inclusion. It's not simply freedom from violence or taunts or insults, but it's really a more expansive view. So, for instance, do the curricular materials, do the discussions reflect the reality in the lives of gender and sexual minority students? If there's political pressures as Donn mentioned, that might be related to religion, are school leaders willing to stand up and speak to those? In Regina, we had an incident last year where there was a controversy with raising the pride flag at one of the schools, and it was clear that there was a lack of leadership from the school board on that. So once again, it's a view of inclusion that is that's active, that's robust, that it's there to, as Bruce mentioned, to celebrate.
No, thank you very much.
And if I could just add that inclusion matters at various levels. So religion also has to be included. So we also have to rethink what we mean by religious attitudes. Canada is a very diverse place, and we need to think about how people from different faith traditions can be integrated somehow in the schools. So that's something that we have to think about. Donn's point that there's no hierarchy is crucial, that one person's inclusion shouldn't involve the exclusion of others. And I think that's across the board, that schools really have to work at how we can include not just US LGBTQ students, but all sorts of people with various differences in the school without excluding other people.
Oh, thank you very much. I was wondering if you folks could speak to how you see this book fitting in with your other publications and the research in the areas of law and US LGBTQ plus students.
Well, you know, for me, this is the third book I've done for UBC Press. So from my perspective, making the case is the final part of my trinity. It's the final part of a trilogy of books dealing with equality rights and full citizenship for US LGBTQ plus students. The first work I undertook emphasized matters from the point of view of students. I spent a lot of time in schools, in classrooms. And I looked to the students. I wanted to empower them. I treated them as experts of their own experiences, because at the time when I did that, it was a time when safe schools had a sort of limited understanding, and nobody really was defining safety, and certainly no one was paying attention to what at the time we would refer to as queer students or pansexual students or LGBTQ students, in terms of what they had to say about, well, what makes you safe? And in fact, in Ontario, there was a piece of legislation called the Safe Schools Act, but everybody really was talking about what made schools safe. And so I decided to focus on students and see how they conceptualized safety. And they conceptualized it very broadly, not in terms of how there's, in terms of doing more than just responding to incidents of violence or verbal abuse, but in fact, very lofty, very impressive conversations about changing the culture of schools in order to make schools safe for them, which was the complete opposite to how many of the, not all, but how many of the schools were conceptualizing safety, which was in terms of seeing the students themselves as the threat. And so schools would have safe schools committees, and they would talk about security guards in the hall, or cameras, or devising dress codes. So don't wear a hat, because if you wear a hat, we can't see your face on camera. Don't wear baggy clothes, because, well, then you can hide weapons. So really pursuing safety in an entirely different way, whereas the students themselves wanted to focus on the heteronormativity of the culture. They saw that as the problem. So my early work was really a very student focused. And then the next phase, I guess it's fair to say, put more emphasis on teachers and how teachers could animate or bring to life those aspects of that broader conception of safety that the students talked about, because then those broader conceptions started to take hold. And so we got to a lot of support for an educative piece, a transformative piece that would change the climate or culture of schools. And that was the sort of the focus of the middle part of my research, certainly the focus of the second book. And it also fit in very nicely with other research I was doing at the time in a SSHRC-funded project. But percolating through all of that work, and percolating may not do it justice, because it was more significant than that. It was a theme, was religion, the role of religion. So whether you were talking to students or talking to teachers, religion was there as a theme that made its way through all of that research and work. And so I really wanted to drill down, I think, on that religious piece, which is this book. Because as I say, it was one of the themes that was showing itself in all the other research I was doing. People who, the role of religion and the use of pointing to religious beliefs and practices as a grounds to oppose or stymie equality rights, and what the law had to say about those kinds of claims. So for me, I'm really happy to have these three books, these three different aspects of my research, and happy to have this as the last of the three, because not to say that it's complete, but there's a sense of completeness to it, of 10 to 15 years worth of work. So that's how I see this fitting into my work.
I started working in this area back in the early 90s. And of course, the work back then was more trying to get the protection, or trying to figure out in what context the protection would exist. So the difference between what we're doing now and then is quite striking to me in a way. A lot of the work then had to do also with how people spoke about sexual minorities. And again, for the most part, in the 1990s, we were talking about lesbians and gays. And in particular, how legal institutions or aspects of the state, judges, politicians, and so on, felt permitted to talk about sexual minorities and whether that was right or wrong. In the new millennium, I started working more, partly with Donn and Paul, but on institutions and how those who are minoritized can fit in certain institutions. For example, we started work on schools. I did quite a lot of work on same-sex marriage, not just the institution of marriage itself, but also contexts in which marriage commissioners or other people performing marriages could be allowed to decline to officiate on the basis of their own religious beliefs. We did some work, or I did some work on schools then too. So this sort of seems like a natural progression to come back to the institutions, that is the schools, students in the institution, but also going right back to the work in the 90s, the labeling and the importance of feeling included and having ownership of your category rather than being put in a category and being told that, well, that's what happens to you, this is what you deserve, this is who you are. Can I also say, John, that that most lawyers will know me for work in a completely different area. So most of my work is actually in the law of obligations and secured transactions, lending, and so on. And so one of the things I like about doing that work in this area is that everybody's interested in this. Everybody has a stake in this, that you don't have to sort of live in that corner all the time and only do work in that area in order to have something to say, in order to have a contribution, in order for this topic to affect you, that this affects everybody. And so I find this a really invigorating topic to work in, partly because I have to say that the Canadian courts, perhaps less so politicians, at least in some places, but the Canadian courts have been incredibly supportive on the whole over the last 3 decades or so. And so I think I see no reason why that shouldn't continue. And that's one of the reasons why in the book we hope that 2S LGBTQ students and people who support them, their parents and everybody else, takes heart from this.
Yes, and then there's me. I must confess, I'm the new person here on the block in the sense that this is my first book on the topic, and I'm just really honored to be able to work with Donn and Bruce, who have deep roots and a lot of wisdom. And I would just say generally, in my area, I've always been interested in education and the charter, and especially the protection of minorities. And then I had a chance a number of years ago to write a couple of articles with Bruce related to the establishment of GSAs, and we published it in the Education and Law Journal. And we basically made a case as to why GSAs are important, and we based it on 3 grounds: educational, legal, and ethical. And that was a great opportunity for me to work with Bruce. And we also wrote an article for a book about the Chamberlain case out of British Columbia. And once again, that was a number of years ago. And, just generally, I've been able to follow what Bruce and Donn have been doing. And like I say, this has just been a great opportunity and a great learning experience for me to be part of the team.
Oh, thank you all. Now, another heady question. What research or work still remains to be done in this area? And what future contribution would you personally like to make in this area? And we can start with Donn again on this one.
Oh, another easy one. It occurs to me that, and I've actually thought about this for a while, how really valuable it would be. I think I mentioned this earlier, to talk to people of faith or people in faith-based schools, to get at that qualitative understanding of why do some people oppose this kind of work. I actually am never afraid of doing that, because to put this as I think it's very easy to argue against the reasons why people oppose it. But more interestingly, I think there are a lot of people who, religious folks, who do support this kind of work. When the debates about GSAs first started in Ontario, OECTA, which is the Catholic Teachers Association there, was very supportive of the bill mandating GSAs when students required them. And there are many people in those schools, school districts, school boards, who do support that kind of work. And I'm all about letting people speak for themselves and letting them be the best experts of their own experiences. And I'm very drawn to that as a next step. I think it would be very useful to really get in there and hear what they have to say. That to me would be what comes to mind as a next step.
Thank you very much. And Bruce, did you have any comment?
I'm always thinking of a million different issues to work on. I think that one thing that would be interesting to examine, and I guess I'm still figuring out whether I'm the right person to look at it, is to look at heterosexuality. That because it seems that is an issue that is treated as a monolith. And is, to a certain extent, while to us LGBTQ students and people have been treated as the other, to a certain extent, there's a sense that heterosexuality is becoming the other. And I think it's important that attention be paid there, not in a critical sense, in the sense of really analyzing what that means, what the dynamics are in that community, and so on. So that's something that intrigues me. Whether I'm the right person to do that is open to question. The other thing that's always interested me, Paul and I go back a very long way. We were in school together. And so and we come from not really rural areas, but really the outer suburbs. And something that's always interested me is that in this type of study, it's usually urban focused, or there's something about schools in an urban setting. The people who discuss these issues are often in cities or towns or university settings or whatever. And I would like to sort of go back to my roots in a sense and deal with how these issues play out, or what the peculiar issues and perspectives and problems are from people who are in more rural settings. And that's just for personal reasons. That just interests me.
And Paul?
I like Donn's idea, and I might just mention, for instance, when we think about religion, the United Church, for instance, is so and far ahead on this, I think, compared to a lot of other congregations. So they have affirming ministries, and there's a church here in the city that I'm in, Regina, that I'm associated with, and recently adopted and became an affirming ministry. And it's really front and center to make sure that the church community is a place of faith for everybody, regardless of. And that's really, I've been impressed with that. And perhaps Bruce and Donn know this, but I recently discovered that former Archbishop Tutu has a daughter who's a lesbian and she's a member of the clergy. And I heard him say that he'd rather be in hell than in a homophobic heaven. And I just thought that's exceptional for somebody in his position. And I appreciate, much of homophobia and transphobia is there because of very harsh, judgmental views that have come out of religion. But there are some spots where there are some possibilities, and I think what Donn is suggesting is of interest.
Can I just interject one more thing? I think that by going to talk to religious folks, you would necessarily have to go into less urban areas, and that Bruce is suggesting, because I think that is a very valuable point. And it's interesting because very often what you hear from people who do oppose this kind of work is that they feel their religion is under attack, or their belief, or as you were saying, Bruce, that they feel othered. And I have a suspicion that one of the reasons for that is that so much of these rights that we're talking about are, in the scheme of things, culturally very new to us LGBTQ students. I mean, it was only in the mid-90s that the Supreme Court recognized sexual orientation as grounds for protection in the Charter. And Bruce, do you remember when I was at UBC, I organized a panel on same-sex marriage, and I brought in John Fisher, who was the president of EGAL at the time. And I remember, so that was in the early 2000s, and I remember there was a general feeling that we didn't know what the courts were going to do with same-sex marriage. And there was very much a popular feeling that a lot of people thought the courts would say, yes, this is discriminatory, but it's justified. And that seems so like an anathema to us now. And so I think that underscores Bruce's point of how far we've come since that time. And people who are not used to making space for other people's rights are not used to making space for other people's rights. And I think largely it's an issue of that. And yeah, I mean, I think that accounts for a lot of the feeling that they're under attack. It's not so much they're under attack as that there are other people who've been under attack for thousands of years and denigrated, marginalized, pathologized, criminalized, or killed, and who now have rights, who are now seeking rights, and are finding ways to fill those rights in very robust ways that are just, thank you very much, but we'd like something more than we just don't want to be beaten up when we go to school. And so I think all of that would be really a very rich and interesting area to dig into, because I think it would get at both sides of what we've just been talking about. Yeah.
Oh, thank you.
John, will you indulge me just to add something else that I think that one of the issues here with othering too is that a lot of the conversation in this area, and arguably including the three of us who wrote this book, between sort of traditional, if I can put it that way, activists on the one side, and then the traditional religions on the other. And even when I say, I'd like to deal with issues to do with rural areas, to a certain extent, that sort of is in that same tradition of looking at the traditions and people perhaps whose roots go back quite a way here. But there are a lot of new religions, and I think that they often feel othered from this conversation, because we think of religion, and when we're talking about this, traditional Christianity or conservative Christianity comes to mind. And when we're talking about 2S LGBTQ people, it's often people who look like us, who appear to you as white guys of a certain age, perhaps, who are doing the talking. And so I think that, it's important that we acknowledge that. And we tried to do that in this book. I don't think we take anybody else's voice, but we do try to acknowledge that we can't speak for everybody. We're trying to listen. But other voices certainly do need to join this conversation, both in terms of people arguing for inclusion as we are, and people whose faith views need to be heard.
Oh, thank you very much. Now, starting perhaps with you, Paul, and then moving to Bruce, I was wondering if you could speak to the significance of this book for heterosexual allies or for parents of 2S LGBTQ plus students.
The allies. So I would say, first of all, I think the book's an invaluable resource for allies, and it's a way for them to educate themselves about the issues that are really important to gender and sexually diverse students in our schools, and to find out what they're up against. And I think not only is it about education, it's about moving to action. And there's, based on our study, we suggest that there are concrete ways that allies can be supportive and take up the project alongside the sexual and gender minority youth. So I had mentioned this before in terms of a reflection in the curriculum, in terms of the materials, in terms of the discussions, in terms of setting up organizations such as GSAs, standing up to parental pressure that might come from people whose faith views are offended, or they may perceive themselves to be under attack. And also just acting as role models and having the courage to say we need to walk alongside those so that our schools are truly inclusive. And just a last point on this, and it's if we think about the structures and the context of our book, it really goes to the issue of privilege and power. And when we think that in our schools and school systems, most people are cisgender and heterosexual, there's an assumption that everybody else is. And obviously, our whole book is, the premise is that we have to challenge the culture and we have to change the climate. And that cannot be done on the shoulders of just the sexual and gender minority youth in our schools. So we need our allies to step up and be there. And I think, as Bruce had mentioned earlier, if we really want to think about the type of school environment and this type of school climate, it's really one that focuses on celebration. And until we make some substantive changes, then I don't think that sexual and gender minority youth are going to feel really part of that. So.
In terms of parents, I have a sneaky suspicion that the parents I would most like to read this book might not read it. But I'm hoping that those who do, those who are supportive, take hope from this, that they realize that what the law can do, what the law has do, what's possible. The other thing I'm hoping is that to a certain extent, parents who might not quite understand the situation that their children are in, if they know that their children identify as 2S LGBTQ+, that this book might provide a little bit of explanation. It reminds me when I came out, which is a very long time ago, somebody suggested that what I do is you have an emotional conversation with your parents, but you can't really discuss things, but they need time to think about things. And somebody suggested to me that I give them a book, and this is a book that I presume is long out of press. And I just left it with them and said, here's a book that you might find useful. I don't think my mother ever did read it, but I know my father did. And he said that it made a lot of difference to him. And he actually used what he learned in that book to help other parents in a similar situation. So I'm kind of hoping that that might be the case here. And to understand, some of the language, the terms, and what the children or what other people are talking about, because some of that can be baffling, even to understand perhaps some of the legal terminology or the concepts that are involved, which are set out in this book.
Thank you. And I know that Carrie, one of the publishers, also pointed out in the chat that not only does it help people to understand the language, but it also gives supportive parents the language to use to help others understand as well. Now, there are obviously 3 authors of this book, and I was wondering if you could speak to how you divided the work among yourselves and whether or not each of you had specific roles in the writing of the book. Perhaps we could start with Bruce on that.
Well, yes, it's just as well you didn't start with Donn here, because Paul and I really have to bow down to Donn, who we actually refer to as our leader. Donn really spearheaded this. There's so much of Donn in this book. We started this quite a long time ago, 5 or 6 years ago, I think it was. And we had very defined roles. So we each wrote, I don't know, 3 chapters or whatever it was back then. But then there was we had input to each other's chapters, but it needed to be brought together, sort of to be synthesized. And Donn really did the work there. He did the hard work. The publishers know Donn because Donn did most of the communication, in fact, almost all the communication with the publishers. And so it was an effort where we did split up the work initially. And to a certain extent, that was the easy part. But then the hard part came in trying to bring it together. And the form that it takes now, the accessibility, the narrative quality of it, and so on, that all comes from Donn, Dr. Short.
Yes, and I would just echo what Bruce is saying. If I say it simply, Donn drips with determination. And in terms of eloquence, it's just, from when we first started, it read more, there was perhaps a little more legalese, or it was narrower in terms of accessibility, whereas now the language it's beautiful and it's eloquent, and yes, thank you, Donn.
Well, what do I say after that? Thank you.
Whoever the before you talk, Donn, can I just also add that we think we were lucky with the people we had at the press. They helped a lot.
Yeah, yeah.
Sorry, Donn.
No, I was going to mention that also. Well, some people may know that I have a bit of a background in the theater, and I have been very lucky. I've written about 6 or 7 plays, and they've all been produced. And so I always try to tell a story in what I write. And I just once I got the book, once we put all the chapters together, I just treated it like a piece of theater. And I thought, well, there's a story to be told here. And I did what we say in the theater is a page 1 rewrite. And it really was a line by line page 1 rewrite, which I ended up doing twice, as a matter of fact, simply because I think that all of us as authors, and I know UBC Press as well, are interested in producing books, publications that function as a book from start to finish, that this is a book, it's not a series of connected articles. And so I really tried to find the unity of the piece and to tell a story. And if you do read the book, you'll see pretty clearly that it in the same way that 2S LGBTQ rights, even the nomenclature itself has been on a journey, so too the book is written that way. There's a starting point, an all aboard point to the book, and then there's a final destination. And that's really what guided me when I wrote it. And with a really very, very helpful comments from the co-authors, peer reviewers. We had a lot of peer reviewers, and all the editors at the press. So it really was a journey writing it, and I think it's a journey to read it. I hope it is.
Oh, thank you all. Bruce, you made reference to the challenges inherent to bringing it together. Would you say that what would you say is the greatest challenge inherent in that process?
We have our differences. So we're three different people, and although we know each other quite well, we still have to try to understand each other's perspective, each other's situation, both in terms of our own sexuality, in terms of our own religious belief or non-belief, and so on. And I think the other thing too is what we're asking schools to do is to challenge our preconceptions, because we're basically saying that schools can't continue to remain rooted doing things the way that they've always done just because they've always done it that way. And we have to do that as well as people working in this area, that things change. Donn was mentioning the 2S LGBTQ+, which sort of gets changed, a new letter gets added or some such thing. And so we just have to keep understanding why that's important and challenge our, as I say, our own preconceptions.
Oh, thank you very much. So we're just about to reach the top of the hour. So just in closing, I was wondering if each of you could speak to the one thing, the one takeaway that you hope readers of the book will bring with them when they close its final page.
Oh boy. I'm going to sound very repetitive. It really is the fact that the law is more supportive than people might think. And I'll just, for the sake of adding something new, I think it's not only important that schools do this kind of work, but that it's necessary and that only they can do this kind of work to get at, I believe that you can never start this work too early, and you have no choice about doing it, because schools are already teaching in the informal places of the school, the participation in sports, conversations in the schoolyard, the hallways, lessons that denigrate and marginalize 2S LGBTQ students. And there's a whole theory about that in the sociology of education. It's referred to as the so-called hidden curriculum, the informal ways that students learn. And therefore, it's really necessary. And I think that that starts in kindergarten. And that, I think, argues for starting this kind of work early. So the necessity to do it and the need to do it early to counteract what's being taught in the unofficial curriculum and place smack in the center of it 2S LGBTQ+ students in the manifest or official curriculum. The official spaces of the school are brought into play to say no to all that from the various early grades, to welcome and celebrate 2S LGBTQ students as citizens of every school from the first grade to the moment of graduation.
And I would say, I guess, that as I said at the very outset, that inclusion does matter. And I think it's important for everybody to realize that what might seem to me like a detail, might seem trivial, might seem just a question of semantics, can be hugely important to somebody else. And you just have to try to the extent you can, particularly in an education context, particularly dealing with young people, to try to be sensitive to that and to understand what might be very important to them.
And I would say, when I come back to Donn's notion of story and narrative, that is used so masterfully to tell what we're trying to convey here. Really, that change is not only necessary, but it's possible. And we only have to look to the examples, whether it be MacDougall or Gabriel Picard or Azmi Jubran, and all very courageous individuals. And they show what is possible. And that, for me, is truly inspirational.
No, thank you all. I know that, Paul, you earlier made reference to Donn's eloquence, and I'd like to extend that to all three of you. It's been a real pleasure hearing from you and sharing in your own eloquence and the incredible insight on display both tonight and in this book. Again, the book is Making the Case, 2S LGBTQ+ Rights and Religion in Schools, published by UBC Press. If I could end on a note of shameless capitalism, I would point out that it is available from McNally Robinson Booksellers. So please do feel free to get in touch any way you can. You can visit us, you can give us a call, you can order the book online. Either way, we'll find a way to get this incredibly important and incredibly good book into your hands as well. It's such a valuable resource, and I'm grateful to all of you for writing this book, for sharing the book with the world, and for ensuring that we can highlight its publication in this way. So thank you all so very much for your time.
Thank you.
Thank you.
And enormous thanks to everybody watching both now and in the future. Again, this video will remain live on our YouTube channel, so please do feel free to share this with any you believe might benefit from its viewing. It's been such a pleasure spending the evening with you. Thank you all so much.